Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster for the Sony PlayStation, much like Chan in one of his movies, had to brave a series of obstacles in order to see the light of day. Released in 2000, the game faced significant challenges in terms of development woes, gameplay and story shifts, and the danger of being overshadowed by the impending PlayStation 2. Does the game dodge these hurdles with Chan's usual flair, or does it need to be sent to the ER? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Considering how popular Jackie Chan was in 2000, there's surprisingly little information I could find about this game. This is the Wikipedia page for Stuntmaster. Seriously, that's it. When searching for the game on Hardcore Gaming 101, this is what came up for search results. Which is ironically appropriate, considering I had just as much trouble finding information on the Divide when I made that video. What we do know is that Stuntmaster had, let's be nice and call it a protracted development period, at least for a PS1 era action game. Despite what Wikipedia says, both EGM and GamePro mentioned it as having been announced at E3 in 1998, the same year that the first Rush Hour came out. That makes sense, as despite not being specifically based on any one of Chan's films, it would still have been able to ride the wave of the film's success. The game was planned to revolve around the rails for Jackie's new movie being stolen, and him, with the player, running across New York to try to get them back. Most of the Game Magazine previews for the time said the game would come out during the holiday season that year, or early 1999. It wouldn't have the chance to do that though, as any word on the game would evaporate until November of 1999, when new previews would start hitting video game magazines. By this point, significant changes had been made to the basic premise of the game, and the release date was updated to early 2000, a deadline the game would meet this time. Now, okay, I know that nowadays a roughly 2-year development cycle is pretty much standard, but things were much different during the PS1 era. Remember, for example, between the original Resident Evil's launch in March of 1996 and March of 1998, Capcom was able to build essentially 2 working versions of Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis would come out just a year after RE2's release. So yeah, there were delays, but they weren't necessarily for the reasons one would expect. Well, that I could find at any rate. As far as I can tell, the game's publisher didn't cause any problems with the game's development, at least none that have come to light. Speaking of, that publisher was Midway. You know, that Midway. But the game itself was developed by Radical Entertainment. Oh, come on! Seriously? I swear we don't do this sort of thing on purpose. There was no plan to cover 3 Radical developed games in quick succession, just like we didn't plan to cover so many Infogrames Atari games last year. It just sort of worked out this way. Well, at least we don't need to go too much into detail on Radical's history, because we've already covered it. Twice. Actually, it also makes sense that the Divide was what came up when I searched Hardcore Gaming 101 now. Okay, fair enough. What we do need to go into, though, was Radical's state at the time of development, because it wasn't looking so great. In talking about the delays the game faced when it was shown to the gaming press again in late 1999, EGM was, less than tactful about it, glibly commenting that they had first previewed the game 50 years ago. Official US PlayStation Magazine and PSM did comment on the delays in their November 1999 previews, but were more diplomatic in their approach. None of these previews actually talked about the reasons for the delays though. I was able to find IGN's article previewing the game just before its release, and it was a bit more forthcoming, but only a bit. It briefly mentions that the delays were the result of Radical having financial woes during this period, so while development did continue on the game, it was significantly slowed down as a result. When it did release though, the game that showed up was much different from the one initially previewed in 1998. For one, the premise had shifted from a meta-narrative about rescuing one of Jackie's films to, well, being one of Jackie's films. Jackie is now a perpetually hungry package courier tasked with delivering a mysterious but important package to the not at all ambiguous Temple of the Shaolin. His truck containing the package is stolen, and his grandfather is kidnapped while he's distracted eating, so Jackie must race across New York in order to rescue both his grandfather and the all-important Shaolin package. It's a fun setup that really feels in line with Chan's preferred style of movie, significantly more so than his previous home console game, Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu, released a full decade prior. The thing here, though, is that while it doesn't go full-on wuxia like Action Kung Fu did, this premise feels like it is borrowing from a more supernatural film than is typical for Chan. To be more specific, while both Gamers Republic and OPM point out that Stuntmaster feels like an interactive Rumble in the Bronx, it does also feel like the devs were influenced by John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, even if just a little. There's a relatable nice guy delivery person tasked with delivering a mysterious package, which then gets stolen and has to be recovered from a large kung fu trained organization. Sure, there aren't any wizards or ghosts or anything of that sort, but given the ending cutscene, the Shaolin package is either magical, or Marcellus Wallace has lost his briefcase again. Quick aside, can we go back to that intro and take a moment to appreciate that Radical decided to model Jackie's mouth being messy from eating? It's a little detail, but a nice touch. Actually, more than a quick aside, because it's a nice bit of character / world building as well. See, since Jackie's character is food obsessed, it makes more sense that the health power-ups in the game are all related to that aspect of his character. A bowl of rice, a container of noodles, and milk to wash it all down all play into Jackie's perpetual desire for food. It's one way that the game weaves Jackie's unique personality into the experience. That's not the only way the game does that though. Chan did all of the motion capture for the game, and his personality comes through in all of his 32-bit avatar's movements. Whether in cutscenes, leaping about the levels, or while fighting waves of bad guys, Jackie's distinctive movements make him immediately recognizable. More than that, Chan recorded not just dialogue for the cutscenes, but a wide variety of lines that he says during gameplay. Everything from imploring enemies to talk things out instead of fighting,
let's sit down and discuss this, liar just...
to chiding the player for pausing the game.
Are you just going to walk away?
The sheer amount and variety of lines Jackie offers throughout the gameplay is impressive.
I should have stayed in bed. If you want me, you have to catch me. Garbage in, garbage out. I should have worn a life jacket. I am very angry with you. Oh, where's my head? Here we go again. This is gonna hurt in the morning.
Admittedly, some of them wind up being played far too often, especially if the player is dying a lot in a specific area, which will happen, and they get tiresome. Overall, however, they serve to give Jackie's character even more charm, as well as highlighting both a unique aspect to the experience and an interesting shortcoming. We'll get to that in a moment though. Chan's level of involvement with the game's production makes sense. As IGN pointed out in their review of the game, Chan is a gamer, in particular a massive Sega fan, which actually makes it kinda sad that this game didn't get, at the very least, a Dreamcast port. Given both Radical's and Midway's financial issues at that point in time though, it also makes a certain level of sense. On that note, the art style for the game also feels like a direct extension of the personality Chan brings to his films. Instead of opting for a more realistic graphical style along the lines of Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, or Tomb Raider, Stuntmaster opts for a more cartoony aesthetic. Jackie and his opponents are all kinda squashy, but still exaggerated, which allows them to demonstrate more personality both through their exaggerated design and through the motion-captured movements. As with Ghostbusters for the Wii and Wind Waker, this design style has aged far more gracefully, precisely because it's not trying and, let's be real here, failing to be photorealistic. The one issue I have with the aesthetic is with the cutscenes though. There seems to be a trend from this period of PS1 development where games wouldn't use in-game engine cutscenes, but would use what looks like up-resed versions of the in-game character models. All of the Siphon Filter games did it, Neversoft's Spider-Man did it, Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster does it. I really don't understand why this was a thing instead of just going with in-engine cutscenes, but it's fine. It's fine. Let's go back to the motion capture though, specifically the fighting, because it both makes the player feel like Chan in one of his films, but also has some glaring issues. The actual fighting controls are set up well. The player has a button for punches, a button for kicks, a jump button, a button to grab / throw both opponents and objects in the environment, and a reversal button that I wound up barely using because the timing on it is very precise. Wait. That sounds really familiar. Was Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster a practice run for another licensed Radical game? One we've already covered on the channel? Because the fighting here feels like the beat-em-up action in 2003's Hulk, just with some notable differences. For one, while yeah, both characters are able to grab objects from the environment to use when fighting, those opportunities are significantly more limited in Stuntmaster. Hulk was able to rip off parts of walls or grab debris and just start smashing, which, okay, fine. It makes sense that Jackie can't do that. However, when there are environmental objects to be used, There are only a couple available, and they don't last nearly as long. In fact, it's kind of surprising how much damage the enemies can soak up in Stuntmaster, particularly when using weapons. It wouldn't exactly be fair comparing Jackie's fighting to Hulk's because, well, Hulk? But you'd think Jackie hitting a goon repeatedly in the head with an object would have more of an effect than it does. As it is, the objects throughout the game don't do any more damage than a flurry of fists or a combo of kicks. They just look different visually when implemented. Well, sort of. See, some of the objects Jackie can pick up, like the stool or the pool cue, do have unique animations. This makes them fun to use as they break up the standard action. Most objects, though, use the same swinging animations, whether it's a paint roller or, a giant tuna. This part of the game feels like an opportunity that was missed because of the troubled development cycle of the game. If the devs had had the money and time to properly integrate the weapons, they could have added a whole other level to the Jackie Chan personality infused throughout the game. That's not the only issue with the fighting, however. The lack of variety with weapon combat carries over to hand as well. Essentially, Jackie can launch into the aforementioned flurry of punches, combo of kicks, simple charged attacks, or 2 different types of throws. And that's about it. The combos are just press, kick, or punch repeatedly. There isn't really any mixing, matching, or improvisation, which seems like it would be a deal breaker for someone with as fluid an action style as Chan. On top of that, the game regularly throws multiple enemies at the player at a time, and they all hit as hard as Jackie does. Again, makes sense when compared to Hulk, but it makes Jackie's game significantly more difficult than Hulk's. There are ways to avoid getting ganged up on, but the balance could really have used some tweaking. This complaint also feels like the result of the situation the game and Radical found themselves in at the time. It's clear that Radical was able to fine-tune the hand-to-hand fighting for Hulk, but that's likely because they already had the basics, and basic mistakes, laid out in Stuntmaster. This notion extends to the boss fights throughout the game as well. Each of the game's 5 levels is made up of 3 stages and a boss fight. These boss fights also offer the unique charm and personality of a Jackie Chan film, while also kind of highlighting both the pros and cons of the combat mechanics. Interestingly, each boss fight focuses on one mechanic to highlight. With the first level in Chinatown, for example, Jackie winds up fighting a chef who, it's obvious, samples his own wares. This is indicated because he performs a stomp that shakes the floor and rattles Jackie. It's clear that the player is supposed to use the chef's own kitchen implements which are lying around the environment against him. The problem is that there are only a couple and have the same issues all of the other improvised weapons in the game have. In other words, they aren't any stronger than the player's regular attacks, and they are less than durable. The boss for the waterfront level is a dock worker carrying a... Is that a steel girder? Yeah, it looks like it. Okay. Carrying a steel girder and apparently named Barney. Here you need to use the sidestep button to try to avoid his girder swings, but the sidestep uses a not particularly effective lock-on system, and it's a little too slow to be effective. The sewer level features a boxing clown? Wait, he's a punching clown. Is this a Punchinello joke? Either way, the game wants the player to focus on the dodge roll, because Punchy here weaves like Chan in Drunken Master, so the dodge roll is the best way to avoid his punches while coming back with a counteroffensive. I've got nothing to say here. The dodge roll is pretty effective. 10 out of 10. No notes. In a weird bit of predicting the future for Radical, the rooftop level features, well, Disco Stew. Here the player just needs to be careful to avoid attacks, because Stu will drop everything to start disco dancing when the spotlight hits him, so it's just a matter of dodging him until this happens, and then beating him mercilessly for his hubris. Finally, Dante, the final boss, is just a matter of running to his side and kicking him each time he gets up. The player needs to be careful though, because the boss will take advantage of the fact that a kick combo cannot be interrupted or have its direction changed. Okay, so maybe the last 2 bosses are more about highlighting their personality than a new combat skill? That's fair though, because each boss has a unique personality, complete with voice clips and responses from Jackie. Here's the thing though, if that's all there were to the game, if it were just a straightforward beat-em-up, then the discussion would stop here and the game could easily be dismissed as shallow, repetitive, and not worth the time. Just go play Hulk instead. That's not the case, however, because the fighting, while difficult and a little awkward, is not actually the majority of the gameplay. Remember, the game is called Stuntmaster, and it delivers on the name. What Stuntmaster does that Hulk doesn't is provide a number of platforming and environmental challenges which play to Chan's fame and notoriety for doing his own jaw-dropping stunts. Throughout the game, Jackie faces a number of death-defying scenarios, some of which actually borrow from other PS1 games. For example, one of the first set-piece stunts in the game has the player and Jackie running from a semi-truck barreling towards him. The player runs directly towards the screen while avoiding obstacles in the path in order to escape. Yeah, Chan may escape the truck, but not the comparisons to Crash Bandicoot. The game offers more than that, particularly in the sewer level, where Jackie and the player make their way to the subway system. Here, Jackie must jump from moving train to moving train while dodging signs, lights, and low-hanging beams, and fighting off attacking bad guys. It's exceedingly hard, but also incredibly satisfying when you manage to finally pull it off. In addition to the major set pieces like that, there are constant setups which earn Stuntmaster its name. Jackie and the player are constantly performing wall jumps, sliding down rooftops, dodging steam vents, flame jets, and swinging crates, jumping across platforms floating in sewage, bouncing from awning to awning, leaping from crumbling ledge to crumbling ledge, and so much more. In fact, this is another game where I'm not ashamed to say that I used save states extensively. Here's the thing though, I didn't just use them because of the game's difficulty. Although there is also that, especially in the second half of the game, which expects absolute mastery of the controls and timing. No, I found myself using save states because I really wanted to nail the stunts perfectly and wasn't happy if I didn't pull them off just right. The action really brought out the perfectionist in me, which is why I have about 6 hours worth of gameplay recorded for what should have been a much shorter game. That's not to say there aren't issues here though. Much like with the fighting, the issues can be compared to another Radical developed game that we've already covered, The Divide: Enemies Within. The jumping doesn't have quite the same momentum issues that The Divide had, meaning that Jackie's regular jumps aren't as hard to pull off when he isn't moving forward, but there is a momentum issue present. The game expects the player to be able to pull off pinpoint precision when jumping from platform to platform, especially in the later stages of the game. The issue is that Jackie has a certain amount of momentum after he lands, which is something that the platforming doesn't seem to be designed to take into account. There were a number of times where I had to be really finicky about the jumping, rather than going from platform to platform smoothly, which is clearly what was intended because of this problem. There's also an issue where Jackie will just get caught in an animation loop when grabbing the edge of a crumbling platform, which prevents the player from pulling him up or jumping away and is basically an instant death. Also, considering the climax of Rumble in the Bronx, it's odd that Jackie can't swim? I mean, between the waterfront level and the sewers level, there are a lot of water-based platforming challenges. Missing a jump here lands Jackie in the water, but instead of swimming back to the start or even coming up with some sort of cool water-specific stunt or challenge, it's treated as though Jackie had fallen down a pit or from a rooftop. It's, let's call it, incongruous in a Jackie Chan game. Even Jackie Chan's action kung fu let him swim in a raging river, after all. Then there are the timing issues that feel like a holdover from Radical's earlier game. For one thing, the wall jump, which is arguably one of Chan's signature stunt moves, doesn't have the timing one would expect. You'd figure that to get the best height and distance, you'd jump towards the wall and then press the jump button again once Jackie's connected with the wall itself. You'd figure that, but nope! Instead, the wall jump is treated like the double jump in The Divide, where pressing the jump button twice in quick succession gets the best result. That's fine because it doesn't throw off the player's rhythm too much, although it did take a while for me to realize and then adjust to it. The problem is that the same dynamic is applied to jumping on the awnings. In order to get proper height when bouncing on the awnings, again you'd figure that hitting the jump button as Jackie connects with them would be how it would work, kind of like jumping on a trampoline. Instead, the player needs to once again hit jump twice in quick succession, making it another double jump scenario. The reason that this is more of a problem than the wall jumps is that with the wall jumps, the penalty for failure is just that you land on the ground you jump from, so you need to try again. With the awnings, more often than not, Jackie will fall from a great height, which means one of the player's takes will be lost. And that distinction between lives and takes is an important one to make, because there's something more going on with Stuntmaster, something that I'm not entirely sure the developers were aware of. See, in making Stuntmaster a pastiche of Jackie's films and adopting the language of film, lives are called takes, Jackie regularly calls cut when the player dies.
Cut! Hospital!
The credits contain a number of in-game bloopers, and so on. It opens itself up to the dynamic Laura Mulvey discusses in her 2006 book, Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image. Mulvey's book is about, well, a lot, and it's a little hard to summarize it in just a few sentences. Without getting too far into the weeds, she essentially discusses how cinema and the moving image, particularly when viewed with modern home video technology, which allows for sequence breaks, rewinds, repetitions of clips, and so on, act as both a refutation and an embrace of the psychoanalytic death drive. In other words, when a moment is recorded on film, it is both a recognition that that moment is lost forever, and an attempt to capture that moment to be endlessly replayed. This is brought into even more stark relief here, considering that each take the player attempts is actually going to be different because of the interactive nature of the game being played. Ironically, those save states I mentioned earlier play into this concept even further. The save states are a later technology which allows for a reconfiguration of what came before, extending the playtime and the takes available. This isn't just me overanalyzing the game or anything either. See, while I'm not sure the devs realized what they were doing in this regard, I cannot say the same thing for Chan himself. One thing I have yet to talk about here is the collectibles in the game, which take the form of lucky dragon pendants. Now, I didn't have the time or energy to meticulously collect all of them, particularly since they can be hidden in breakable objects, and it's never obvious what is and is not a breakable object. If the player does collect all of the dragons though, they unlock a final stage unconnected to the story, the Shaolin Temple from Drunken Master. After beating that stage, the player is rewarded with behind-the-scenes footage with Chan, demonstrating the motion capture for the game and interviewing him about his experience making it. When asked about why he wanted to take part in making a video game, he said this.
I never done this before. I want to try, see what happened. And also, the game and the computer, you never get old. Then I can see myself on the computer for long, just stay on my age. I can get old, but the computer never get old. So I think I better keep my movement. Maybe something I can move today, cannot move 10 years later. Then keep my movement, keep my acting, put my humor, everything put in the computer. Then one day, just like a memory. It's a game, can show to the audience, and can give the kids to play, and also can keep the memory for myself.
Despite the game being made a full 6 years before Mulvey's book was published, Chan is essentially discussing a similar notion. Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster takes risks by trying to bring the beat-em-up genre into 3D, while also combining it with 3D platforming. While not based on any one of Jackie's films, the pastiche on offer feels authentic to both Chan's style of movies, as well as Chan's personality and style of movement, both in terms of fighting and performing stunts. There may be issues with the core gameplay mechanics, issues that Radical Entertainment would iron out in later releases, but Stuntmaster still gives the player the feeling of coordinating and pulling off death-defying stunts. This feeling, along with the charm and personality throughout the game, make it a good weekend rental.
This is Lieutenant Jack Morton. The train has been taken over by terrorists in a sudden attack.